experiment with the egregore of the order within chaos. Perfect order is not possible. There's always the fraction and fractional numbers to consider. Um, have opinions, whatever you like, on how numbers work and how mathematics work. Fractions do exist. The looking for the order within the decimal points after pi is an example probably of trying to look for the order within the randomness that is pi. So oddly enough, a number like that might be classified as an irrational number, and subsequently an irrational number can be used to derive what is a very rational, stable shape, namely a circle, through the equation pi r squared. So the idea that the irrational or the chaotic or the fractional does not create order is kind of obviously untrue when you see it that way, because an irrational number is the basis of a rational shape. So the order that comes from that chaos is balanced out through ordered variables such as r squared. So the adding of a rational variable to an irrational variable, if done appropriately, could potentially create the order from the chaos, as it were. But it does not actually create order within the chaos that is the fractions of pi. So that which is irrational stays irrational until it encounters a rational force. So when a person engages in illusory correlations, they seem to be trying to find the order within the chaos. So it's like they're looking into the decimal point in pi, and they're trying to find the patterns within all the numbers that make up the decimal points of pi. And it's very interesting how often that results in projections by the observer doing it. There is whether or not there are actually genuine orders within the fraction of pi is something that a actual mathematician can answer more effectively. Nonetheless, what might be the case is that the observer is looking at those random numbers and they're trying to find the rational in the irrational. And the rational force in that case that's acting upon the irrational is their mind attempting to apply reason to something that is not reasonable. And so the struggle to accept the irrational is one of the things that lead to the anxiety of the world not being as perfectly structured and ordered as people would like it to be. Perfect symmetry is something that might need to be given up on. The chasm, for example, between the beautiful fractals and the dimensionless white light or whatever, that different people have observed throughout the ages. Some called it the Einstein or the Einstein wall, and so on and so forth. It's come by different names. Would probably argue that the chasm is the place of the irrational. And there's a lot of sorting behaviour that goes on when you cross the chasm, sorting from here to there and everywhere else. And so the ones that, what you typically find is that there's beings that try and push an agenda and try and use force because they want their particular projection of what is the rational to take precedence over the other ones. And so from that particular space, what typically comes of it is scientific reasoning or philosophy. So if something is trying to force something, force their version of rationality onto a situation, it becomes irrational if there's no evidence to support their arguments, or the issue has already been addressed, or there's a different alternate hypothesis. So the force continued to push that agenda, then that force would demonstrate that it's irrational, not necessarily in the same sense as the decimal points of pi, but irrational in the sense of illogical and perhaps truly insane. So if you encounter something like that or someone like that, so just for argument's sake, if you were dealing with one of those really pushy people, okay, an example in ordinary life might be a really pushy person who just absolutely insists that it has to be that way, but there are, in fact, alternate hypotheses possible that have better explanatory power and perhaps even are more helpful, beneficial to the situation. And you can demonstrate why those alternate hypotheses have potentially greater merit than theirs. If they force the situation, then they're behaving irrationally. In the sense of the scientific sense of the term, they're behaving potentially abusively in the forceful sense of the term, depending on the intent and consequences of that force. Now, when you change the results by measuring it, you're not proving your argument. What you're doing is demonstrating that you've created a situation. You haven't proven that that's how it actually was before you created it that way. So if you say, you've always had a smashed plate on the ground, you're a messy person who's always had a smashed plate on the ground, and then you smash a plate on the ground, and the person goes, well, it wasn't like that before you smashed the plate on the ground, mate. That's, you might want to argue something different, like, well, the plate just got smashed now. And they said, no, it was like that 20 years ago. You did that 20 years ago. And it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. You did that just now. But we've just put a time code on it to say that it happened 20 years ago. Look, we've got a texter out and put 20 years ago on that smashed plate to say it happened 20 years ago. If you're dealing with something like that, okay, that is irrational in the sort of forceful kind of crazy way. Okay, that kind of stuff you might experience in what's called the chasm or the abyss. Occasionally you get characters who are a bit like that. They have agendas, as it were, to try and convince you that that smashed plate was like that 20 years ago, when it wasn't. It only just happened. So if you look at it that way, that's a type of irrationality that is distinct from the decimal points of pi. Because the decimal points of pi are neutral. They're not trying to force you to do anything. You just go, well, that's a weird fucking number. How do you deal with it? Then you might project your reason onto the numbers to try and find any patterns that might be in it, which is a distinct behavioural pattern from the plate was smashed like that 20 years ago when they just dropped on the floor then. So that type of being able to distinguish between irrationality in the logical sense of the term and irrationality in the what the fuck man sense of the term are clearly two different skills. And it's surprising how often that the irrationality in the what the fuck man sense of the term can apply to people who are supposedly well-functioning individuals. So it's surprising how often there are people who are classified as not well-functioning individuals who can actually see that that's irrational and can point out an alternate hypothesis and even do so eloquently, perhaps, and just aren't heard because the agenda is a forceful one, or it's a contextually a forceful one. It might not be the intention of the people involved at all, but that's just the procedure. And so when you're dealing with procedure and dogma and doctrine, that kind of has a secondary sort of consequence of covert forcefulness, in the sense that the independent actors within the scenario might not want to be forceful. They might want to be gentle-handed. They might actually want to be helpful, but the doctrinaire situation might dictate a particular behavioural response, which is obviously forcing people into a position where the plate that got smashed yesterday is being declared to have always been like that, despite other arguments being possible and even fact-based. So when you try and determine which one it is, it's based on the evidence available if you're doing it scientifically. So when it comes to evidence, what's admissible evidence and not admissible evidence might be contextual as well. So this is where it gets really loopy for people, is that if you're trying to figure out the chemical makeup of a compound, well, you might have a Bunsen burner and you might have a microscope or something like that. So that way of measuring those things would apply to that particular material. However, if you were trying to measure how many people drive down the road on any given day and how likely they are to stop at the stop sign, that requires a very different set of instruments and documentation skills to observe that. So you can't get your Bunsen burner out and your beaker out and your microscope out and just sit it on the side of the road and expect it to figure out how many cars are driving past. And likewise, you can't sit in a laboratory with a survey paper and a tick counter, just ticking how many cars went past, to go, oh, well, if we figure there's going to be 20 cars going past, that'll tell us what the chemical makeup of carbon monoxide is. It's like, it just doesn't it just doesn't work. So the sort of hyper focus on reason and evidence that science is known for has an irrational component as well. So obviously when people doing the scientific method, they're aware of things like you don't bring surveys to a laboratory to test compounds, and you don't bring a Bunsen burner and a microscope to the side of the road to measure traffic. So what becomes irrational is where this scientism stuff comes into it. So scientism is when you get pulpit scientists who are proffering their personal opinions, which of course as people they're allowed to do. However, there's an implied assumption by the audience that because they have a particular, say, a doctorate or something like that, maybe even more than one doctorate, they could be very esteemed and very good at what they do. That's not in dispute. The issue is that people might have trouble discerning between their personal and professional opinions, and so they might assume as scientists that other people that because they're aware of logical fallacies, or the idea of them, that they might be less likely to do logical fallacies than members of the general public, who might not know what logical fallacies are, for example, which isn't true. As people, they engage in logical fallacies also, and it's also the case that the general public does as well. And one is appealing to status or authority. So it's a case of the expert isn't always right, but the member of the audience isn't either. And they are both capable of being factually in error and both capable of being factually correct. So the truthiness of the statement has nothing to do with the status of the speaker. It goes back to that logical fallacy, right? Or addressing that logical fallacy. So the irrationality is a sort of it's been expressed more recently in the United States with what's called Tescreal. So Tescreal or Tescreal is that sort of Elon Musky, Peter Thiel kind of cyborgy kind of cult, which is very much scientism. Okay, it's sort of got some kind of cult of personality around it, and sort of sci-fi dystopian kind of vibe to it. So it's less about what's truthful in science, and more about taking that out of context into a extreme for a cult or a cult purpose. And that is a form of irrationality as far as treating it scientifically is concerned. So, yes, in science there are ideas like the singularity, for example, artificial intelligence, technology, so on and so forth. However, what they're arguing isn't necessarily the truth of each component of idea that they're referring to. It's a bit more complicated than that. Anyone with experience or knowledge in the area of consciousness, for example, whether it's spiritualist experience or psychology experience, for example, would probably tell you that those guys are trying. They probably do consult people who have some experience in that. However, when it comes to the cultural projections that people have, or cultural myopia, that is a genuine feature of the psychological and spiritual experiences that people have. And as a consequence of that, it becomes a little bit like the rational mind projecting onto the decimal points of pi. So Tescreal is an example of a John Nash type effect of people projecting their cultural myopia onto the decimal points of pi, basically. And likewise, you'll find things like the Sephirots, for example, as an idea. I haven't studied Kabbalah very much. I know very small amounts about it. Know there's this thing called Sephirots, and a word called Ein Sof Or, basically, and a tiny little bit like that, not really much at all. Okay, and these ideas are maps, not terrain. Okay, so anything where you talk about doctrine, dogma, the symbolic mappings associated with different ideas, and the language that different groups are using to describe their experiences are maps, not terrain. Words do get taken out of context between different groups. So there are science words that have been used in a completely different way by the New Age movement, for example, like the word simulation, for example, or the word or the words universe or multiverse. There's also the other way around, where sometimes the sciencey groups take their words out of context too, and so that's sort of the common feature appears to be there's a whole bunch of people who've been looking at the decimal points of pi and projecting what they think to be the reason in that disorder, or the rational within that irrational, and what's behind that a few steps is an OCD-like phenomena where people are uncomfortable with the idea of chaos or chaotic systems, and or just randomness more generally, and that type of anxiety is associated, unfortunately, with the strictness of doctrinaire, dogmatic societies. So, this is probably why you get this phenomena of the trendy hipster who's a bit of a spiritualist type character. He wants to be like Buddha, man. He's got a beard and everything, and he's smoking a spliff, and he goes out and he goes camping, and he gets a little caravan, and he outfits gets a van, and he outfits the back of it, and he puts a little kitchenette in it, and a little fold out sofa bed, and he drives around, and he gets tattoos, and he thinks it's and there's weird earrings that like the lobe rings, and he's just like, yeah, man, and it's like he's such a snag. He's a sensitive new age guy, right? Okay. And he can swear blind. Oh, the sea life is just so terrible. Like, you got to get out in nature. Mother Earth loves everyone, man. Right? Okay? And you know what he's doing there? He's just letting go. What he's done is he's let go of the 9 to 5, strict, ordered, well, you'll get a fine if you dare draw a picture on a brick wall, type of thing. The hyper strictness of the urbane lifestyle, and it is hyper strict. There are places in the world where graffiti is for example, just as an example of where this strictness might apply. Graffiti is an art form in its own right. It can be a beautiful art form if done properly. And where it's not considered beautiful art, it may be classified as a messaging system, a means of communication between different groups in the area, and it's not necessarily gang related. Sometimes it's a type of symbolic intelligence, and so graffiti is an ancient art form that goes back to, they found graffiti on the Valley of the Kings in ancient Egypt to start off with. There's graffiti in ancient Roman ruins that they've found. Like fuck Caesar, like shit like that. Caesar is a dickhead. Like people have actually done stuff like that, and it's carved in the stone, right? And they couldn't get it out, right? And then thousands of years later, someone's dug it up and gone, oh, that's fucking hilarious, okay, right? So graffiti is a ancient. Graffiti is kind of where permanent art form was started. Like the first art galleries were caves and rocky formations, and technically that was graffiti because they were scribbling on rocks. And scribbling is probably an understatement of what they were doing, but scribbling is one way of describing it, and graffiti is a bit like that. So this idea of telling people that they can't do something that their ancestors have been doing for about 1.5 million years, or at the very least 200,000 years, definitely 200,000 years, which is, wow, that looks like a cool surface to draw a picture on. That looks like something you can draw it with. Let's have some fun, right? Like it just doesn't sound like it's pro-human behavior. It's like shitting under a tree. Okay, presuming you wash your hands afterwards and you cover it up with leaves, and you don't flash your ass at someone else or crap on someone's dinner, it is actually a natural act to do. So there are some things that have been, unfairly shamed by the strictures, the forceful dogma doctrine of the "we'll give you a fine, here you scribble on that brick wall" society, and the tenseness that creates for people as they are limited in their creative, artistic, and social expressions it acts almost like a repressive force, where people that expect perfect order and perfect symmetry, they want their sleek appliances with nice stainless steel and the perfect matte finish furniture and not a skerrick of dirt anywhere. But if you've got a bit of mud on your shoe, it means you went out for a walk. It means you lived. So there's something to be said of that escapist mentality and why they're doing it. They may have been people once, those snags might have been people once who got to that phase of crossing the chasm of the abyss, and they tried to find the order in the fractional decimal points of pi, to use that metaphor, and just went, well, fuck that, and left. The problem is society, man, screw that, and they've left. And they've done something else, and they've found happiness there. Because, yes, society is too strict. It doesn't necessarily favour creativity. It doesn't favour anything that doesn't produce a person who is capable of expressing themselves in accordance with whatever the social standards is of the people they're hanging around at the time. You have to only have had the perspectives, worldviews, and experiences of the people in your environment. Otherwise, you're just an outsider who is to be targeted in some capacity or another. And the origin of that, unfortunately, isn't necessarily Christianity, but because Christianity did get it from somewhere else, nonetheless, in the Anglophone context, it's Christianity. Christianity teaches people that if you're not from their in-group, you're the bad guy. And so you'll probably find the New Age movement tries to pretend like it's Christianity when it's definitely not. And so, without further ado, why do people try to fit in so much just to get Patreon dollars and viewers? Why aren't you happy with your fugliness? It's a good thing to age. It's a good thing to age disgracefully. If you lose your teeth, take for example these teeth, okay? You'll notice the entire top row is missing. A few years ago, over the last 7 or 8 years, there's been 14 deaths. Yeah, 14 deaths in less than 14 years, and 6 of them happened in 1 year, including my stepmother. And those tragedies coincided with the teeth starting to fall out, until the point where dental surgery was required to remove the shards and chips of teeth, and it was pretty awful. It took a couple of years on emergency waiting list, and the pain was terrible, and the anxiety was extreme, particularly because it coincided with grieving. And you would expect that someone would be embarrassed to talk to you on YouTube, like looking like a gummy bear, like looking gummy, with wrinkles, with messy hair and whatever else, povo, because you get more viewers or something like that if you're pretty, if you have a nice backdrop, if it looks like it's a professional video or something like that. But so what? There's a very strange phenomena where in the 21st century, with the rise of social media, the personable is marketable. Oh, you just like everyone else. You're the everyman, you're every person. But to be the regular person, you have to want to be a Hollywood superstar with beautiful outfits and flawless teeth. Look, that's not what the every person is. The every person is a fugly person with wrinkles and bad teeth who stinks like a fart because they just did one, okay, has dandruff. I mean, they wash their hair, of course, usually, okay, and has a bit of dandruff and isn't particularly attractive, okay, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. So just take that as a gentle reminder if you hadn't figured it already. The phrase fugly old maid is not pejorative, it's pride. Have fun.